that little bit of browning has a reaction to the eggs, and so that just changes how the eggshells work. It's another little benefit, but not necessary.
Another great question, and thanks for asking, is do you have to use the compost tube? What do you do if you don't want to use the compost tube?
Actually, again, it's a very flexible and forgiving system. You don't have to use it, but we recommend filling it with something. Now, that said, people have used it without it being filled and not had a problem. But then again, I've troubleshooted some issues on some towers, and it turns out that their compost column wasn't filled, and they were having trouble with the watering. The compost in the column actually helps moderate the water loss in the system, and plays an important part in the hydration or hydrology of the entire unit.
So, so my first instinct, because this is a composting column, I would go online and buy finished compost and just fill it with finished compost. But you just said that your system can only use like 10 or 15% of that. So would it be better to just fill it with the soil and the fertilizer that you used in this?
That would be fine, and I don't even know if fertilizing it is a good idea because it's going to draw roots to it. And then you have your roots intertwined in the compost column when you go.
Well, it's going to draw roots to it.
Eventually, yeah, you don't need to change the soil every year. In fact, we've had soil in towers for 4 or 5 years now.
5 years almost.
Without any problems. You start to get drainage problems. It stays wet on the bottom. It dries out on the top. Things like that. That can all be a function of the soil and how well it's draining.
Okay, so you don't have to use worms. You can fill this with soil.
Mm-hmm.
You can fill it with soil with a little bit of amendment or something like that. You can fill it. It doesn't, but you really shouldn't leave it empty, because
it just can make it trickier and it might dry out on you.
Well, and you see we have these holes like we talked about before, so there's air movement in there, which is only going to dry it out even more if there's nothing in there. So, absolutely not required to do the vermicomposting side of it, but encouraged. And if you don't want to deal with the worms, you don't have to deal with the worms. You can just fill it up with something else.
It is one of the features that makes it work exceptionally well. So you're really
I mean,
kind of missing out if you don't, but it's not a problem. I mean,
and it is also part of what makes it a patented system, right? Mm-hmm. Is the integrated worm vermicomposting. So let me see what this lasts. I have huge seeds growing inside my compost column.
Okay, so that's another point to the difference between composting and vermicomposting. And that's why we recommend that you can use certain weeds, but you should never use weeds that have seeds, because those seeds will germinate. And so when you put a muskmelon or something in there and the seeds from it, or tomatoes, that's one thing is you're going to find in your compost, in your castings, anywhere you put that. It might show up in your house plant. You'll have volunteer tomatoes. You might have a volunteer
And that's because this doesn't
melon.
get hot like we talked about with a
Correct.
regular compost. So it doesn't kill the seeds.
Correct.
It just gives them some moisture and they start germinating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you probably don't want to put stuff in here that has seeds if you can avoid it. Or you empty it and you have some seed starts and just plant them up.
I kind of like being surprised. It's like, oh, what is this? Hey, it's a melon. Do I want this here? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I have had that happen where I've pulled the compost out and there was seedlings, and it was like, okay, I don't know what this is, but it's a tomato. I don't know what kind, or it's a cucumber or something. Like you can tell if it's a melon, and it was like, oh, I just stuck it in a pot and let it keep going. So it's not going to hurt anything. But if you put a lot of stuff in there, then it's gonna take away a lot of the nutrients because the seeds are starting, right?
Yeah, but then again, they're just breaking down because what happens is they end up as worm food then.
Oh yeah,
right?
they're not getting any light,
so
they're just gonna.
It doesn't really steal any nutrient because it's all still contained in the system.
There's no light, and they'll just rot.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly. You'll put browns on them, and they'll be gone.
Well, that's simple enough. Let's see. Should you always try to keep the tube filled?
It's a process. Again, it's a continuous flow-through bin, so you're constantly taking stuff out and adding it. So the answer is technically no, because periodically you're breaking it down, you're taking a couple drawers out, you're pushing the level of the compost down, and then adding to that all over again and starting all over.
So
not starting all over, but continuing the process.
So I just realized the time, and I've taken a lot of your time today, and we still have a few things that we have to cover because we've been on for almost an hour already.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Just fun to talk about compost. So we're at the end of the season, right? Especially if you're in a warmer climate, you can grow just about all year round, and you keep maintaining this. But if you're in a climate like we're at, which I don't know, like I said before, I think we're zone 6B or 5A, so right on that cusp. We have at least a week of below freezing temperatures. And so if you leave this outside and you have steady, consistent low temperatures, the whole thing is going to freeze.
Eventually it will. Because of the thermal mass, it takes a long time, and that would mean if it's not warming up during the day, even on a cold day with sunshine, this will gain some heat. That can help protect it at night when it gets really cold. But after a period of time, if it's successively freezing or below for successive numbers of days and nights, it definitely will freeze.
So what do you do in the winter? Like, I've spent my whole year raising my worms. I've named every single one of them. I want to keep them happy. And now winter's coming, and they're going to freeze.
Yeah, so then what you would do is you'd start emptying out the bottom compost out of the drawer, taking the compost out, and bringing that level down. And as you do that, again, you've got your 3 buckets or 4 buckets. One is where worms go, one is where dry browns and the dry matter goes, or stuff without worms in it, and then there's another bucket of castings. And so there may be some grades in between that are partially finished stuff.
Right.
And so as you do that, you get to the worm colony where most of the worms are. And then so what you can do is move that into a simple plastic tote. Like I said, there's all different types of worm bins, and now they have home worm bins.
Plastic tote.
You can use a plastic tote. That's a very small one. I have some other big 15, 25-gallon totes that I use. And I will just line it, and like this, I just put a layer of, in fact, the whole thing, when I started this, the whole thing was as big as only this pile, okay? And I added compost, and I added more browns to that. When it started getting done, when it was like at 80%, I created a new pile over here, and it drew all the worms from this pile over to this pile. And so there are still some stragglers in there. If you dig through those castings, you'll still find some stragglers in there. There's probably cocoons that will hatch out in a week or so.
So if I empty out my compost tube, and I've kind of pulled it apart like you're talking about, I have stuff that's not really digested yet, stuff that's kind of in the middle, and then my finished worm castings,
and then your worms,
and then the worms.
Major worm colony. Yeah.
And so if I put it in a big, those, I call them storage totes, right? In the winter, where do you store it?
Like anywhere you can. It's just a matter of what works for you and convenience. We have a partially heated garage. It doesn't freeze when it gets really cold out. It does get to freezing, but the bin was big enough that didn't pose a problem when it got below.
So you could put them all in a garage, or or even in your house.
It's got to be slightly protected. They don't eat as much when they're cold, and so it's a matter of not needing as much maintenance. If you cool them down, the cooler they are, the slower they are.
So if you have a nice, cool, dark place, like garage in your house, maybe even a shed that's protected, like it's not...
We actually had one really creative supporter and dedicated, I might add. The only place, she lived in a very small place and didn't have any place to do it, so she put them in a dish pan under her bathroom sink in the vanity. That was the only place.
That's dedication.
And it worked. She kept her colony alive for the winter.
But so when they know it's winter and your house isn't going to be as warm as it normally is and whatever, so they eat less. So if you're preparing, if you live in a climate where you're gonna have days, multiple days of freezing weather 24/7, you're gonna want to move your worms someplace else. And
turn your drawer over. Empty the leachate out of the drawer and turn it over.
That's a great point.
So that if you get water, leachate in your drawer and it's freezing thawing, those freezing thaw cycles could theoretically crack the drawer.
Okay. Yeah.
you
So
wanna turn
flip
your
the drawer over.
upside down and for overwintering.
Yeah.
And then the other thing about overwintering a tower is about covering it. The biggest thing that degrades the plastic is UV. And so there's a 5-year UV protectant in this, but it helps. The time when it takes the most beating is when it's not planted. Most of the year, during the time when the sun is at the hottest point of the year, the tower is actually pretty well protected by plants. So in the winter, when it's not planted, you want to put something over it. It could be something like a large contractor trash bag. It could be a barrel grill cover, Smoky Joe cover type of thing, or an air conditioner cover, something that's semi-permeable, so a little bit of air and water can get through,
Okay.
but not fully expose it and protect it from UV.
So if a couple questions here from Cindy and Brianne. If you put them in a little, Tupperware container or whatever, don't you have to put drain holes in it, or is it going to be messy? Like it's gonna.
And that's a great question. It goes back to the first thing that we talked about. The biggest mistake people make is overfeeding their worms. I've been involved in different vermicompost communities on Facebook for a long time. People are always having problems with their indoor bins. That they get too wet and they get anaerobic, they get stinky, and things like that. And the answer is always you're overfeeding. Cut back on the food. There's too much moisture in there. And the other thing is not enough browns. When I started my indoor bin, and this bin too, I put a cushion of browns on the bottom, and that helps absorb some of the moisture from the food scraps that are breaking down. So in my little tote bucket, that was this by this, maybe a 15-gallon tote, I layered it and put 2 inches of browns, and I put 2 inches of straw and hay all around the side of it. And then I put the food and the other compost in the center of it, and then piled more browns.
And you don't really have to feed them. Like if you put some food in to start, when you move them into, you probably don't even have to feed them for a few months because it's so
especially
cool.
if it's that cool, if it's 40 degrees, then yeah, they're not going to be eating a whole lot.
Right. Sorry, I got massive allergy stuff still happening, so let me pull up these other questions that we had. And see if we've answered the rest of them. Or just reiterate for some people that are just joining. So Brianne had asked in advance, can cardboard go in if I just cut it up into pieces?
Yes.
The answer is yes.
Yes.
Right. About
you just don't
1
want
inch.
big chunks of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or strips.
How many worms do I need to start and maintain the salad tower?
That
And
would be about
500 to start.
500 to start is good.
Okay. Let me find the rest of these. I don't know that I've ever had this question before. So I'm going to put you on the spot.
Drum roll, please.
What's the best plant-soil-worm ratio to start out with?
Plant-soil-worm ratio. That's actually one of the hidden design efficiencies of the garden tower, is that there's something about this ratio that works. Meaning that the soil column, because of the grow rings, the soil is actually continuously connected. Even though it's built in layers, that is one continuous soil column from top to the bottom. There's something about the ratio between this amount of soil and this much compost that works really well. People have asked us, why don't you make a smaller one? And there's a couple reasons for that. One of them is that the hydration factor. We talked about how watering a garden tower is not just like watering each of the plants, but it's really giving the whole tower a good thorough soaking so that everything gets wet and drains down through the tower.
Which I'm going to do right now because I just noticed this is dry. So
good point. Good point.
You might want to make sure I don't splash you, Tom.
So this is I think I will. So the ratio between the soil and the compost column works very nicely. If we make this smaller, one of the concerns we have, we want it to be as successful for as many people as possible right out of the box. And making it smaller would cause it to dry out a lot quicker. So you would have to be much more attentive to watering it and how much you are watering it. But that's just one of the factors in producing something smaller. The other thing has to do with the basic nuts and bolts of the cost. Because of the design and development that went into the base, even if we sold a smaller version, it's not going to be much cheaper at all, because most of the cost is in the base and the production of that and the compost gate. Thank you.
Yep, sorry about that. So, how do you recommend replanting between seasons? And then every season, should you add fresh soil or turn it over?
So replanting, that's a good question. You don't need to turn it over every season. You don't need to change the soil. However, it really depends on what you're growing in the tower. There's certain things that will overwinter in the tower. Chives, strawberries.
Oh, yeah.
In fact, we have a tower right back there that's got some nice strawberries coming on already. This early in the season. Imagine that. So there are certain things that you won't pull out. There's some crops that are biennial that you can actually get 2 years out of, things like broccoli, but generally the heads are much smaller, and so people just tend to replant. A lot of people aren't aware. People think about gardening and they think about starting in the spring and you go through summer. But there's actually a couple of different periods of gardening. You can start early and start seeds indoors. You start cool weather crops. Cool weather crops are things like broccoli, cabbage, peas, snow peas particular are very good.
That's
and
funny.
Things like that. Yeah, who'd have thunk?
Yeah.
I just learned that like a year or two ago and I was like, well, duh. And so, yeah, there are 3 different periods. You can go early spring with cool weather crops. And then by then you've started your stuff that you're going to plant and have established for the summer heat that's going to grow through the summer. And then you have fall. You have your fall crops and harvests. The long-term things like squashes and potatoes and things like that are being harvested. But at that point, you can have more seeds started and you can grow cool weather crops again in the fall. This is for a temperate area. We're in the Midwest, so that's how I think about things.
Yeah.
In the desert, in Arizona, and California, you're going to be on a different program. But you'll be able to grow, and usually those places do have cool seasons, but they may be very short.
So that is somewhat. I just lost my internet connectivity on that on that tablet. So that's a little bit about the planting side of it, which we have done a lot of videos on already. And there's a lot of resources on our website if you go to gardentowerproject.com and click the Learning Center. But today was supposed to be more focused on vermicomposting, and we have to wrap it up because I know you have an appointment that you're probably late for because it's been over an hour. So starting out, like quick, simple things. Starting out, you want to do a 4-inch layer of browns, handful of greens.
Equal to the amount of the size of the ball of worms that you started with, roughly.
And browns are things that are dry, like grasses, shredded newspaper.
Clean, dried grasses and leaves, shredded newspaper, shredded cardboard.
And then greens are all of your vegetable greens and most of your fruit things. No citrus, no ginger, no onions, nothing that if it, this is what I say, if it squirts you and it burns your eyes, it shouldn't go in. Right.
It'll probably irritate the worms. If it irritates
your eyes, yeah. And then about 500 worms is what you think should start. Okay, so about 500 worms, and you always make sure that you keep a ratio of 1 part greens to 3 to 4 parts browns.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
That'll keep it lofty and still moist, but not stinky. And then at the top, you add, it's always topped off with a 4 inches of browns.
Always maintain a plug of browns to act as a filter to keep pests
So you could
out.
reach in and take that chunk of browns out, add stuff in, and then keep using that chunk of browns if you want.
If you can reach,
Yeah, I can't reach to do that.
Well, you could just reach
yeah,
it's halfway full.
And red wiggler worms are really important. They're not the same as the earthworms, which ones just came up here. The composting worms work on the bacteria from the plants, the green matter, and the earthworms and night crawlers are all about dirt moving and aerating and stuff like that. But you really should get
The
composted.
earthworms, fish and worms, they're vertical dwellers, earth movers, and they're slow composters, and they also don't breed very fast. Red wigglers are very voracious composters. They live in the center of the tower mostly, primarily in that top 10 to 12 inches of material.
And usually the red wigglers that are sold at like Walmart or bait shops or whatever are not composting worms.
No,
they are earthworms.
They're earthworms.
So it's best to get composting
Or night
worms.
crawlers. They're actually Canadian or European
night crawlers.
Yeah.
You should not water the compost column, right?
No
So
water in
we should do a little bit of reiteration on keeping it dry-ish. You know, like how do you maintain that so it's not so wet and there's not so many
by
flies.
maintaining a high ratio of browns to greens. If your compost column is wet and really super soggy, then it means you need to add a lot more browns.
Okay.
A lot more bedding and habitat.
So I'm going to do a quick look here to see if I missed anything.
I just wanted to say we really appreciate folks tuning in, and really appreciate the garden training project community folks. And that's just, I know that people appreciate it as a resource, and we're just thrilled to be doing that, and thrilled to meet everybody in that community. So it's really,
we have a
it's been
lot
wonderful-
of comments of people thanking
a
you
wonderful thing.
for doing this. They thought it was very, very informative. And I think that we've answered probably one last question that I'm just seeing. And I don't know what this is. So maybe Tom does. Should they use a compost starter?
No. That's a good question.
I've never heard of a compost starter.
Compost starter is basically an enzyme formula or mixed enzymes that you throw on a hot compost pile outside to get enzyme activity going.
It's like
that
bread
helps.
starters.
It's a way to speed it up, right?
Yeah,
you're inoculating the and it's beneficial bacteria and enzymes, I think.
So compost starter is for hot compost. It's not meant for a cooler
It's meant for
vermicompost.
a pile compost. It's
Okay.
not meant for vermicomposting.
So hopefully that answered. It says appreciate that. So I think that answered the question. Don't use Sean. Sean Big Shug Books. I think you're on our garden training project page. Don't use a compost starter.
Not needed. Not needed.
But thanks for joining us and watching this. Even though we've done way too much time, but you could talk about this stuff all day. Really, I mean, you could. I'd be like, whatever. But yeah, you could talk about it much longer than I could. So those are the basics. We hope this was really beneficial for everybody. Obviously, if there's questions that we didn't answer in this video, post them in the comments, and we'll do our best to answer those. After we end this live event, then we will be posting up this video so you can share it or rewatch it, though it's kind of long. But it'll be probably in the next 30 minutes to an hour that we'll be able to have it processed and upload back onto the Facebook page so people can see it. Yeah. And we'll do our best to answer all of your questions. And thank you very much, Tom, for taking the time this afternoon to do this and go through it with me, because now I'm much smarter, and I will stop telling everybody that's watching the wrong information. So it's all good. So thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your Sunday, and we appreciate you viewing.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Bye.